Hey everyone, we have finally made it to my favorite topic and the reason I wanted to get into this in the first place, which is now we're going to get into investing and learn how to build and amass wealth for retirement. Uh, for some of you, these first few episodes are going to be a little bit bland. You may already know this stuff, but I'm more targeting people who don't really have any idea about the stock market, how it works, the different types of accounts, maybe even confused by their work 401k. So I sat down yesterday and took some notes, which I'll be referencing here. I'm hoping to do this in an order that is educational and makes sense and slowly builds up. I don't want to talk about what percentage of your money should be in stocks versus bonds before we even have a groundwork for what those kind of items are. So today we're going to start off with what is a stock. And a stock is a share in a publicly traded company. What that means is that at some point in time, a company could no longer raise the amount of money it needed to operate through normal borrowing. And so they have decided to quit being a private enterprise and become a public enterprise. Public in the sense that we are the ones that own it. So the best example I can give you is Lyft just went public about a week or so ago and issued 100 million shares of stock into the market to use that so when they got bought, they could make some money. And then they want to use that money to invest back in the business and hopefully one day get to profitability. But borrowing that kind of money would have been near to impossible. And so now you may go out there and purchase a share of Lyft, and you would be a very small, but still part owner in a growing business in America, which is cool. And you don't have to just buy American stocks, but that's what a stock is. So most companies you interact with every day are publicly traded companies. Google is public, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, General Electric, Walmart, Target, Home Depot. All these companies are publicly traded companies that you can go out and buy shares in. Now, some stocks pay a dividend and some don't. So I really quickly wanted to explain what a dividend is. Usually older companies that don't need all of their profits to grow the business anymore. And I'm going to use Walmart as an example. You know, Walmart's days of rapid expansion are behind it. There's one almost everywhere. So they pay what's called a dividend, and that money comes every quarter, and they tell you what the dividend is per share of stock. So the only one I know off the top of my head right now that's easy is AT&T pays a $2 per share dividend. So every quarter you get 50 cents for every share of stock you own. And you can do one of two things with that. You can either have it deposited in your account as cash, or you can have it go back out and buy more shares. So when I log into my brokerage account and look at AT&T, I own a whole number of shares, and then there's a .209 right now. That .209 is from dividends being reinvested back in that aren't enough to buy a full share. You can either reinvest them or get them as cash, whichever you'd rather do. But that's what a stock is, and then now you know what a dividend is. So if you see that a company yields a 2% dividend, it means that the money they're paying out as a dividend right now is 2% of the price of the stock. So we've hit those. Where are they traded? Stocks are traded on two major platforms, the New York Stock Exchange, which you will see abbreviated to NYSE, and the NASDAQ, NASDAQ. And the NASDAQ stands for National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation System. You'll never need to know that. And stocks are traded there under symbols, so you won't see their full name. Walmart is WMT. AT&T is just the letter T. Some of them are pretty simple that would make sense. Facebook is FB. McDonald's is MCD. Some don't make any sense at all. One of my favorite ones is Southwest Airlines is LOVE, LUV. But every stock will have a ticker symbol. And when you go to look that stock up on a website, you can type in the full name and it will show you what the symbol is. If you turn CNBC on during the day, either the website or the channel you'll see a scrolling ticker tape of symbols and the price of the share and if it's up or down that day. And that symbol down there is the ticker symbol for the company. And most stocks are traded on either of those two exchanges. Foreign stocks have their own exchanges in their countries. So that's where they're traded. Two things you're going to see a lot of is the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500. And I wanted to tell you guys what those two things are. The Dow Jones Industrial Average has been around for almost since the beginning of the stock market, early 1900s. And Dow Jones is more of a news company, but back then they wanted to make a little basket that they said would represent kind of America as a whole. Like these 30 stocks are pretty much the biggest and best, and they pick from different industries and they put this together. And the Dow Jones does change. They add and drop companies all the time. But just keep in mind that the Dow Jones is only 30 companies. So it's a little bit tricky because there's not a whole lot of diversification in there. The biggest one is the S&P 500. S&P stands for Standard & Poor. They are a rating agency. They go out and look at companies and rate them, whether or not they're financially trustworthy, almost like our credit scores. But years and years ago, S&P decided to make what is called the S&P 500, and that is the 500 biggest companies in America by what's called market capitalization. And all market cap is the price per share of stock multiplied by the total shares outstanding. And then the S&P 500 just puts the 500 biggest of them into this big basket. Every year, the goal is to match or beat the S&P 500. So many times, if you start listening to or reading podcasts and you hear somebody talking about did they outperform or underperform the market, they're specifically talking about the S&P 500. The next thing I put on here was, what is a mutual fund? And a mutual fund is where a guy or girl who is a finance professional works for a company and designs their own basket targeting something, whether that be let's say American recreational stocks, things like Disney, Starbucks, things of that nature. They might be trying to make an energy one where it's all energy stocks, but for the most part, mutual funds where you've got somebody out there buying and selling all the time, chasing profit, they are always trying to beat the S&P 500. That is the thing that everybody wants to beat every year. And that's the thing that I honestly have most of my money invested in, is an S&P 500 fund that just exactly mirrors that, because that way you get exposure to 500 companies and it gives you less risk. So if one just implodes, it doesn't decimate all the money that you have set back in the market. There are two other ways to look at stocks that I wanted to make you aware of. One is called an index fund, and an index fund is just meant to mirror an index, like it's meant to mirror the S&P 500, or it's meant to mirror the energy sector, or it's meant to mirror the restaurant sector. And that's an index. And there are dozens and dozens of indices out there. Some are emerging markets, growth companies, dividend paying companies, and people will make an index fund that matches that investing philosophy, and then they just trade it on the stock exchange like a stock, and it's got its own ticker symbol, okay? And the other one is just what's called an exchange traded fund. That is a fund that doesn't necessarily have a guy or girl sitting at the top making the decisions. They just told it kind of what they want it to do with a computer algorithm, and then the system constantly works to make that fund do what it's supposed to do. But for any fund, there is what's called an expense to that fund, an expense ratio. We're paying somebody to create this thing and put it out there for you. And so generally, these computer-generated ones are much cheaper, meaning they don't charge you as much every year as a mutual fund would. And we will get to that later on. I don't want to get too deep into these expenses right now because it's not the topic of conversation. It's just something you might bump into. A lot of people use exchange-traded and index funds to buffer themselves against big losses. So let's say that you have started to invest and you've gotten your way up where you own 10 different companies. If one of those 10 goes bankrupt, then that's a lot of your money gone. If you have the S&P 500 index fund, it doesn't matter in there that, a company goes bankrupt and has to Payless now is going out of business. If you've noticed, you don't have to worry about Payless going bankrupt because you have 499 other companies there to help offset some of that loss. Okay. So the bulk of my portfolio and the bulk of what I do for others is index funds and exchange traded funds. I tend to avoid regular mutual funds, and we'll get into why on that later. The final thing I want to tell you all about is the other thing you'll see a lot of, which are bonds. And all a bond is either a company or the government, either one, wants to borrow some money. And what they will do is they will issue, let's say, $10 million worth of bonds. And the way the bond works is you go out and purchase the bond for a certain amount of money, and we're just going to put it at $100. And then they say, we're going to give you a 10% return. So you're going to get $10 every year for the next however many years. And companies can do a 2-year bond, 5-year, 10-year, whatever. U.S. government tends to do 1 year, 3, 5, 10, and 30-year government bonds. And you hold them for that long. And at the end of that period, they give you the original investment back. So what it is you're loaning them that money, and they are paying you a small percent to borrow it. Remember us talking about interest rates on credit cards being the cost of capital? For companies, the interest they pay on a bond is the cost of capital. Now, bonds don't move a whole lot. They're very steady. They don't really change in price. And so they don't grow a whole lot. As you get older, you do need to have some of your money in a safe place like that. But for me personally, I do not own a single bond, anything yet, and I am 40 years old. I'm not old enough yet to need to move money out of the stock market and into bonds. And then in the next episode, we'll talk about why that might be and the reason you would look at that. But that covers today what a stock is, what its dividend is, where they're traded, which doesn't really matter to you because you're just going to buy them through your brokerage company or your work. The Dow Jones and the S&P, index funds, exchange traded funds, and bonds. And that gives us a good jumping off point. So now you all know kind of what we're looking at when we move into the market. Next this week, I'd like to go over I'm just looking at my notes, so I'm not looking at you guys. The different types of accounts that there are out there that you can open, and there's not that many. So a lot of times if people just don't know where to start, they don't realize what all these options are going to be. And then where to start, where to put your money, how to handle it. And then we'll get into more of the technicals of you learning how to look at data and determine whether or not this may or may not be a good time to purchase the stock, or if this company is really worth owning. We'll get in that later, but right now I've got you all started, and I would say the Motley Fool, which is, I've told you all before, owned by two brothers. At this point, I would highly encourage you to start listening to their daily podcast called Market Foolery. They tend to put stuff in very, very, very plain English, and I like them so much because they mirror me, where I am a buy and hold guy for the long term. I am not in and out of stuff every day trying to make a quick buck. If I buy a company, it's something I'm going to hold for years and years and years, and that's kind of their philosophy. So it might not be a bad idea to bookmark their website and go there some, or start listening to their daily podcast. It's only about 15 to 25 minutes every day, just talking about what happened that day in the world of publicly traded companies, big news. But it'll get you used to hearing some of the terms that we're going to be talking about a lot more. And that's how I did this at 14. I just got Money Magazine, and after about 6 issues, things started to click and make sense. That's what this means, or now I see why they were talking about that. So now that we're getting into the part of your life where once your debt is paid off and we're going to start amassing wealth for the future, maybe going ahead and jumping into those podcasts now, even if some of it seems like Greek to you, would be worth it, because after a couple of weeks, it's going to make a lot more sense. So if y'all have any questions about today's episode, hit me up, let me know. And then later this week, we will be getting deeper into my favorite subject in the world. Y'all have a great Monday. Talk to you later.